Today on the Roundhouse, we are interviewing an expert photographer from the UK. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to The Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozarek, and this is episode number 60 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby. You name it, and we discuss it. Today, I'm so excited. We are talking to Robin Coombes. He is a photographer from the United Kingdom, lives in Wales, photographs a variety of steam subjects, is a master in the art, and I do mean a master. There are so many railroad photographers out there, but you take one look at Robin's photos, he stands out from the crowd. I'll have a link in the show notes. You can look at his stuff, but we're going to be talking to him about some of his photographs and how he's a student at the University of Birmingham in the field of rail preservation. Before we get to him, though, I want to remind you guys that our Patreon campaign is doing very well, thanks to you. And if you haven't contributed, now would be an excellent time to head over to patreon.com/theroundhouse and support the show. At this point, if we hit $200 per month, we're going to do our first ever live podcast. And at $300 a month, we're bringing back At the Rail Yard. Full details on the website at patreon.com/theroundhouse. Our guest today is a railway photographer from the UK who has some of the most amazing photographs you will see, and not just in the sphere of railroading. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mr. Robin Coombes.
Good evening, Nick.
When did you first pick up a camera?
I probably picked up a camera as a very small child, but I quickly learned that having a sort of box brownie, I was not able to sort of reproduce the wonderful images that I used to see in the magazines and the books. I mean, I've always had a camera, but I've never really taken seriously any photographs, probably until 2006 when I had my sort of first decent camera. And that's when I took up photography seriously. So in some ways, I'm a relative newcomer to photography, and I've grown up in the digital age rather than the film age.
That's a really different perspective. I think a lot of people would assume that photographers of your generation are always the type who started on film and then at one point or another decided they wanted to go digital. But you grew up solely with digital.
Virtually. I mean, as I said, I would take the odd, family snaps, the odd railway photographs, but nothing in seriously. And it was an opportunity in changing my lifestyle and personal circumstances and something I wanted to do and take up. And so I discovered sort of digital photography with a small compact camera about 2003 and could see the potential of it. And then bought first sort of serious camera in 2006, which was a Nikon D200. And I've stuck with Nikon since then and grown up with digital photography.
What are your thoughts then on the perceived digital versus film debate? Are there ever times where you feel you'd want to experiment with film, or does digital give you everything you're looking for?
Well, I don't think the medium of whether it's film or digital matters. I mean, the whole point of photography is to produce an image which means something to the photographer or means something to the audience that he's going to share it with. How you capture that, the camera you capture on anything else, is almost immaterial. I mean, it started off with glass plates, and I mean, it would be wonderful as an exercise to go back and go out into the field with a plate camera, because you'd only have one hit at it. You just have a few plates to take with you, and you'd concentrate and do it in a very different style to how you use digital. I mean, I think part of the problem is that a lot of film photographers abide by the rules of what made good shots with film, and it need not necessarily apply to digital. Digital is far more forgiving, it's far more flexible, it'll do things that film can't do. I mean, when you think back to the sort of the great masters of the 40s, 50s, 60s of railway photography, it was all produced on film with equipment that now people would struggle to go back and use. And yet some of those images are absolutely exquisite. They have all the detail, they have all the atmosphere, they have all the style. And even to try to reproduce that quality, even with the best digital cameras, is quite difficult. So you always use the best available.
I could see your fondness for that photographic style of the 40s and 50s, silhouettes in particular. Where did that drive come from? And who are some of your photographic inspirations?
Well, it came from looking at the great masters' books underneath the bed covers with a torch when I was 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that's, if I've got a style or anything else, it owes much to those childhood nights spent looking at those great images. I mean, the images of Eric Tracy, George Hiron, Colin Gifford in the UK, Winston Link in the States. These are the images I grew up in, and it was always my dream that one day I could perhaps ever aspire to even begin to approach what they were doing. But I never thought that it would be a dream that would be impossible, because you couldn't believe that in the 60s that preservation would give us the opportunities that it's giving it today. I mean, today we can see in the UK, we can see steam on Shap, we can see it over Beatuk, we can see it on the sea wall, we even have steam on London Underground. The variety is unbelievable, and it's beyond our wildest dreams. We thought that steam would end in 1968. It would just be a few small branch lines, perhaps in museums, and that would be the end. But the story, because of the dedication of so many people to make it happen, has given us opportunities which are incredible, but it's still very fragile. And it's one of the things which, as was mentioned earlier, I've returned to being a full-time student, because one of the things I want to ensure for my children and their children's children and so on is that they can experience the same drama, excitement of standing on a sort of wayside station at night and seeing a 75-mile-an-hour express rush through the station. You know, to experience that is like nothing else. It's like whether it's the tea clippers going around the Cape or any of the great experiences of life. You can't get it from just a book. You can't get it from a static exhibit. You have to not only see it, you have to feel it. And I think it's when I was looking at those books, I could see the image. I could imagine what it would be like. But until probably very recently, I couldn't experience it, because I grew up, and while steam was still around locally, it had already disappeared from many of the sort of the classic locations. So I missed out. But I've been able to relive that and to actually hear, to see, to feel, to experience what those photographers felt.
Let's start looking at some of your favorite photos that you've taken to explore that sense of feeling. First, we have A4 in the Rain, which is this very bold image of an A4 Pacific underneath electric wires through this very heavy rainstorm. What is the feeling that you're going for here?
I mean, that to me is my favorite image. Why is it my favorite image? Is because I was there and I could experience that, and also how difficult it was to get it. And I mean, it's like so many of the images. I mean, you almost ask the question, why on earth, when the alarm rings at 2:00 in the morning, what drives me to actually get out of a warm bed, travel several hundred miles to actually see and photograph these wonderful machines? And it's all about an adventure. I suppose there's a little bit about living in the past. even though it's in a modern setting. But it's the anticipation that you feel for what's going to happen in the day. Are you going to be able to capture something? And it's almost like an addiction. Can I do better each time? That is an interesting photograph because it breaks so many of the sort of film rules. It's shot in the height of the summer. Most classic railway photographers wouldn't go out other than in winter or spring or autumn, but certainly not in summer because the steam doesn't work in summer. It's underneath wires, which many photographers don't do. The angle is very low down, whereas traditionally you want a slightly elevated image. So there's many things that traditionally you don't take a camera out in the rain. But I mean, that was a day that we chased the A4 Pacific on my favorite line, which is the Settle and Carlisle. Just an ordinary day. But by the afternoon, the sky had turned absolutely black, and as black as I think I've ever seen it. It was a question of where we went to take the shot. This was a location I wanted to do in the Loom Gorge. It's a very famous traditional location. And suddenly the heavens opened. We get heavy rain in the UK, but I mean, nothing in sort of like monsoon standards which you get in Indonesia or anywhere around the tropics where you really get heavy rain. This was on that scale. It was almost biblical the way that the rain came down. And at that point, any normal person would say, forget this. There's only one place I can be is sitting in the car until this goes over. I took the decision that if I was going to get something very special, I was going to have to just brave it and see it. And this is where the sort of anticipation, because the rain coming down then, as I said, it's of biblical proportions. You don't know when it's going to come round that corner. You can't hear anything other than the rain. So you've got really, like in a sort of film setting, you've got one chance at this because you know that the second you lift that camera, the lens is going to get absolutely deluged. So you've really got one chance. When it comes around the corner, you pick your spot, you lift it up, and you just hope that the scientists in Nikon and everything else have worked out all the algorithms and everything else, because you can only do this on autofocus and everything else. Again, breaking the rules of manual focusing and all this, because you just have one chance at this. And it worked. And it was the most, it's the exhilaration and everything else. It comes around the corner, you pick your moment, you lift the camera, and you click it, and you've captured it. I mean, that at this point, despite wearing some fairly sensible rainwear, I am absolutely drenched to it. The great thing was that the camera worked and it captured it, and you actually realise at the time that you're capturing something that probably has not been captured before because the technology has just not been there. I mean, you couldn't have done that sensibly with film. It would have just been down to luck. In some ways, there was still an element of luck there, and you get the image. And that's why, with all those things going into it, a lot of it is about personal emotion that goes into it, and very often there's a degree of difficulty. You'll be very proud of a photograph, and you'll put it up on Facebook or any of the social media, Flickr or something like that, and it'll get very few likes or favorites, and you think, don't people realize just how hard, how difficult that was? But no, people don't. I mean, it's the great leveler, whether the photograph actually connects with its audience. Other photographs that you might have taken on a charter or something like that, which required very little effort, you were very comfortable taking it, and you think, yeah, great, but it's loved by your audience. So it changes. But that was one. It's done very well for me. It's won awards, and something I'm quite proud of.
These photos that we're discussing will be in the show notes for the episode, so you can have a look at these for yourself, and you should. But to describe what we're looking at a bit more in detail here, technically, I love the fact that the headlamp is right in the lower right third. So there's the roll of thirds going on. It's spot where it should be. I'm also really loving the halo effect that's occurring above the steam locomotive, above the passenger cars, the glow that's emanating from it. Those are two elements in particular to me that frame this just right.
Yeah, and I mean, you cannot plan for that because until you see it, you have no idea what that's like. You just have to make, in a lot of steam photography, you have to think on the hoof. How much you can, in that situation, because the elements are extreme, I didn't know how the rain would react. That halo I've not seen before. You don't know it exists until you see it, which is why you have to take these things in real. You can't create them in Photoshop, because until somebody takes a photograph of it, you don't know how the rain actually reacts with it. You don't know how bright the light's going to be. You don't know anything until you. And one of the things that fascinates me about the photograph, if you look around the corner, there's a very bright. One of the roofs of the carriage is brighter than the others. There was lightning going on at the same time. Whether that's lightning reflected in that carriage, I don't know. I can't tell. But something's going on.
What is your philosophy with Photoshop?
My philosophy with Photoshop is that none of the images are manipulated unless I actually say they're manipulated. And the reason, and by manipulation, I mean changing something in the photograph. I don't like to remove anything. I don't like to add anything. I don't like to change anything. So that's my definition of manipulation. And the reason for that is that if the photograph is to have any value, it's got to have historic integrity, so that someone could look back at that photograph and saying, well, that was the headboard, that was the light, that was the way the carriage is, the livery and everything else. So I'm very firm about manipulation. There are one or two shots that I've taken which perhaps we can talk about where there is manipulation, but I always make that absolutely clear that no one can be in any doubt about it. In terms of enhancing, Photoshop is absolutely invaluable. Every image is processed through Photoshop in the same way that you process film through a darkroom. It's down to what I would call enhancing, and whether that's slightly changing the saturation, the levels, the contrasts, the curves. That's just doing the same things that used to be done with chemicals are now done with bits in an electronic digital world. So yes, if you might improve the sharpness, you might change the saturation, but essentially those images are as they come out of the camera.
Looking at another photograph of yours, Castle on Cheltenham Flyer Express. The scene we have here is a Great Western Railway steam locomotive rushing at the camera. It's pretty much centered in the frame, and it's a zoom pan, meaning that the locomotive is sharp, and then the carriages behind it are slightly less sharp, but everything around it is moving with the locomotive. It's blurred, but it's blurred in the direction that the locomotive is moving. How did you learn to master the art of the zoom pan?
It was something I'd seen other photographers doing, and it was a technique which I've probably become associated with. It really is trial and error. It's something that I do a lot more of now than I used to, because it's very high risk, and what people don't see are the ones that don't work. They only see the ones that work. A bit like a doctor can bury his mistakes, or an architect, unfortunately, his mistakes are visible to all the public. For the photographer, he only publishes the ones that work. It, to me, is that I'm always looking for techniques that will push the boundaries, which will represent the dynamism, the drama of steam. And as a technique, in the same way for motor racing, where the technique was really sort of developed, it's ideally suited. I didn't used to do it very much on mainline, because you've got one hit at that and it's too high a risk. As cameras have improved and I've practiced it much more on charters, I now use it much more frequently and I'm getting more successful results. That was a case where, again, it breaks a lot of the rules of taking photographs off an overbridge head on. That was a special run, reproducing the world's fastest train in the 30s. To do that on today's main line is amazing. I mean, it takes an enormous amount of cooperation to run a steam locomotive at close to 80 miles an hour in what is a very intensive mainline service, but with goodwill and cooperation. Therefore, I wanted to sort of have the drama of that when it was running at full speed, 4-track mainline. That, to me, is what I want my children and children's children to experience. It's that speed, that drama. You have to remember, for that locomotive, which is slightly special for me because I can remember it in real time in the 60s, it was a locomotive that was allocated to Cardiff and was just common. I mean, you could go to the local overbridge, which we spend much time on, and very often see that. The fact that it ended up in Barry Scrapyard, a complete wreck, but a dedicated group bought it and restored it over many years, and not just restored it so that it steamed again, but was capable of passing all the very stringent tests to put it onto the main line. And not only is it being put on the main line, that locomotive has actually broken records that have that existed since the steam age. It was the loco that ran from Plymouth to Bristol and beat the record that was in the 60s. So it's not just restoring a locomotive. It's restoring a locomotive that will run express steam on the modern railway. And that makes it very, very special.
One of our listeners submitted a question. Nicholas Arthur Rezar says, are there any railroads, locomotives, or locations that you keep coming back to, and why?
One of the things I want to capture is the steam age in all its varieties, every different weather, every different location, all the different locomotives. It used to work 365 days a year, 24 hours a day in every wind, weather, and everything else. So I think it's very important that you capture all of that. There are obviously places, there are lines, there are locomotives that are my favorites. I mean, I love the Settle and Carlisle line. It is so special when you're there, just the feeling of it, the Highlands of Scotland, the sea wall on the Devon coast. There are locomotives that have become favourites because I can remember them from my childhood, or just the pure design, or the engineering excellence, or whatever it is. So I've got favourites, but at the same time, I'm trying to capture as much variety as possible. But yes, there's always places I would like to go back to. Said probably the Settle and Carlisle is my favourite line.
One of the places that you've been to internationally, which fascinates a lot of rail fans, is China. And you had the opportunity to photograph Chinese steam in revenue service. And China was one of the last bastions in which you could see that. What was your experience there like?
Incredible. I mean, again, it was partly a dream come true because I missed out in the 1990s when steam was probably at its pinnacle and going over Jingpen and everything else. It was a great regret. I wasn't chasing steam at that time. I wasn't photographing it. And it really got down to the last wire, and there was an opportunity for a trip. It was an organised trip done by Tim Little, and it was done in a lot of comfort and a lot of luxury, which I was extremely grateful for. And it was a chance to see industrial steam. And until you go back into that environment, and I mean, we're incredibly fortunate in the UK. We can see steam regularly on the main line. We can see it in charters and everything else. But until you go back and you see steam working, and it recaptures all the memories, and it's not just the steam loco, it's everything else around it. It's the industrial environment. It's the pollution which you can taste in your mouth. And we look back very often with rose-coloured spectacles at the industrial past, but you just forget just how awful and grubby and dirty and terrible it really is. It's full of atmosphere, but in truth, would I want to go back and live in that environment? The answer is no. But it was an incredible experience to be able to go back and recapture not just the sights, but the smells, the sound, and everything else of working steam. Sadly, in truth, although we can reproduce it on very small scale, we can't produce it on the larger scale. Our focus when we take these photographs has to be quite narrow, because outside that stage set, it's the modern world. And I mean, part of the things that I want to do is, the history of steam goes on. I mean, the period since 1968 is 40, 50 years. It's longer than what was regarded as the golden period between 1948 and 68, which was a mere 20 years, or the period of the Great Big Four when the railways were grouped in 1921 to 1948. Again, these were only just over 20-year periods. Steam's had a history since the late 60s, early 70s of now 40, 50 years. So it's got its own history, and it's important to capture that. So I enjoy capturing steam in a modern environment. In many ways, it's the modern environment now, the trains, the liveries, and everything else, which are changing far more rapidly, is the stable part of it.
I greatly admire the fact that, especially when you do the charters, but even with your modern photography, you're placing equal emphasis on the people and characters that surround the machines, because I feel like so much of the story of railroading lies in that. One image that is particularly strong in my mind is that of a mother and her infant child, Industrial Revolution era, like 1850s, 60s, waiting on a train. There's something, as you describe, very stark about that image.
Yeah. Again, you can't plan for these images. They either just happen or they don't. And it's really down to you, as your skill as a photographer, not only to see it, to see the opportunity, but then to capture it in a way that it gives it meaning and emotion. And I'm glad you picked that photograph, because it's one I'm very pleased with. And I do a little bit of, I just go reenacting myself. And it's very difficult to do, to try to live and experience those parts, but it just adds to your own understanding of it. And it's a group of reenactors called the Ragged Victorians, and they go to enormous lengths to get their characters. They make a history for each of the characters. The degree of detail that they go to in terms of their clothes and making sure that there's no modern parts or fabrics or anything else is amazing. And by doing that dedication and attention to detail, you can capture incredible images. But railroad and railways is, I mean, purely from the technology, it's wonderful pieces of engineering. But when it's sitting there dead in a museum, it's meaningless. You have no idea what it can do, what it sounds like. And it's the same with the people. It all comes together to make this enormous collage of which is our legacy from yesterday.
And while events like these do happen on a narrow scale, and there's no way to fully expand them to life size, so to speak, they are a very narrow world. On the other hand, it gives you an opportunity to appreciate all of the details which you would otherwise miss, because our modern world is full of plenty of detail, full of plenty of human interest, shots, snapshots, and stories, but we take those for granted because we live in that world 24/7. We don't think about it and put it on a pedestal. When you're looking at historic periods, that detail shines more because we're trying to analyze that more.
We're trying to understand, because what the past will do, if we can understand the past, perhaps we can have a better perspective on where we are and planning our own future. So history, you can argue whether it repeats itself or not, but understanding how things like the technology of railways change the world in an incredible way. I mean, you can draw all sorts of parallels with the internet revolution, the agricultural revolution. These were major events in human history, and how people responded to them is very, very important to understand.
Photography came to you later in life. I'm curious, what has your career path been up to this point, and how has that shaped how you connect with trains?
I mean, railways have been my lifelong interest in all forms. As a child, I spent many, many happy hours at the local station. Yes, I was a train spotter, but it was more than just a train spotter. I was just fascinated with the whole environment of railways. I trained professionally, went to university as an architect. I was very lucky that fairly early on in my architectural career, I had a chance to join British Rail as an architect and design stations and signal boxes and various other railway buildings. I then, because I enjoyed being on the railway as such, moved away from architecture and actually moved into a full railway management position. I was marketing manager for several of the lines out of London. And then my career direction changed. I joined the bus company as their marketing director, and then went back to full-time architecture, where I spent 25 years with one practice. I've always, being an architect, you tend to be creative and you have to present and live in a 3D world. Imagery has always been very important. I took the odd photographs here and there, but I existed much more in drawings and architectural imagery rather than pure photography. So yes, there's been a creative element throughout my life.
And you notice these details because your career was creating these details and then managing these details.
Yes, and I mean, it's interesting because am I interested in architectural photography? Sort of, because I'm interested in buildings and in spaces. But architectural photography is actually very difficult because the buildings don't live. The only thing about a building that lives is the people and the activities that take place within the building. I mean, the beauty of the steam locomotive is that it's not just a wonderful engineered machine, but it lives and it breathes. It glows in the dark. It sounds wonderful. It's a living, breathing machine.
For a lot of people outside of the UK, there's the perception of the UK was all about steam, and then it wasn't. And then it had preserved steam on railways. Because you worked for BR, though, what were the best things, in your opinion, that came out of British Railways pre-privatization?
Pre-privatization. I mean, in truth, if you go back to the 50s, the railways really were on their uppers. They were not so much poorly managed from an operational point of view, but they were very poorly managed from a political, national viewpoint. They were losing a vast amount of money. They weren't invested in. When in 1955 you had the major modernization plan, it was poorly thought through, but there were still some good things that came out of it. I mean, probably what British Rail is best known for was the creation of the intercity brand, where you introduce regular trains running on a clock face, quarter of an hour, half hour between the major cities, electrification, the lifting of standards, high speed between cities of Britain. And that really was a revolution in its own way. And because at that period, it was competing with the early motorways, it was competing with early intercity airline travel, and was very, very successful. The numbers increased dramatically. So in that sense, it was very successful. The Hst Train, which really was a result of the failure of what was the high-tech APT train, but the HST was an incredible branded train that changed the nature of rail travel throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and has probably been the world's most successfully engineered train. I think the way that the Network Southeast, the London commuter services work, and I mean the pressure that they're under to deliver that many people into city centre locations, what essentially is Victorian railways. again, very, very successful.
And has paved the way for some of the successes of privatization, as well as all of these fantastic mainline steam excursions that are able to take place today, that you are able to document, that really provide an opportunity for these machines to do what they were built for. Yes, they're earning their keep doing 25 to 30 mile per hour on heritage lines, but they are also doing 75 miles an hour on a main line. And that requires the infrastructure and the regulations and standardization to carry all of that off on a very regular basis.
Yes, and that's where what we have today. Steam on the main line has always been incredibly fragile. It started in the 1970s, and it was down to the dedication and perseverance of a few individuals who made that happen and would not take no for an answer. And that's really characterized what the whole preservation movement has been about. It's been overcoming the impossible. Everybody said they were completely stupid. Everybody said it would never work. And yet they have proven them wrong time and time again, creating incredible opportunities for us to experience today. But it's always going to be fragile. Steam was going to finish the last time that a BR train driver was going to retire. That didn't happen. There are a new generation of footplate staff that are carrying that tradition on. As the main line is getting more intensively used, high-tech signalling, the digital railway, all those are putting incredibly pressure. There was a case of West Coast Railway with the incident with Tangmere. Those things, statistically, they can happen. Steam will only continue where there is tremendous goodwill and political imperative that it continues. So it is very fragile.
Part of that perseverance, in one of our past episodes, we were talking about the story of Barry Scrapyard and how hundreds of steam locomotives that were destined to be razor blades were preserved and are now operating. You, based in Cardiff, you grew up not too far down the road from all of that.
Very much so. I can remember, it was where, we went to see what were effectively the last time we would see those locomotives, because we all expected them to be cut up very quickly. Barry was just one of very many scrapyards that, forget how many, but we're talking about literally thousands and thousands of locomotives that were scrapped over a very, very short period of time. Barry, for some strange, inexplicable reason, didn't scrap them, and they were there long enough for people to actually raise money enough to pull them out and rescue them. And without Barry, yes, we would still have rescued steam locomotives that were bought direct from BR, but we wouldn't have anything like the variety that we enjoy at the moment. And it was just down to a fluke.
Speaking of mainline excursions and your home base in Cardiff, one of my personal favorite images of yours is the Great British Breakfast with the two Black 5 steam locomotives. So the scene is we're looking through a window, and through the window we see the high-rises of Cardiff. We see two steam locomotives leading a mainline excursion train. But the foreground, we have the traditional English breakfast. I love how the story comes through on this particular shot.
There's only one slight problem with that. It's not my image, but I'm very proud to say it's my son's image.
So it's on your photo account. That's why I made that mistake.
Yeah, if you take, because my son is probably even a better photographer than I am, and it's the reason that certainly the Flickr site is called Robin and Taliesin is because I'm Robin and Taliesin is my son. So a lot of those images, we don't differentiate between who we take them. And that's really down to father and son rivalry, so that in terms of whether people like them or not, it's a level playing field because we're very competitive. With that image, he won landscape photographer that. And so that was completely his image. He thought it through and he took it. And it's why I always say that a master shot really is only about 6 inches, because I was sat next to him. I took a different shot. He wanted to take that to include the breakfast. And it just demonstrates that, again, the photograph is all about telling a story. And many of the images on the Flickr site bar his, we would be standing next to each other, but we would take very different photographs.
That's a really interesting way to be able to connect with your son and compare notes as far as what your individual styles end up being. And yet there are certain similarities in the fact that I can't look at one photo and clearly say that was Taliesin and that photo was Robbins, unless you're in the shot and he's taken it of you.
That's right. I mean, there's a very nice shot of which I think is a marvelous shot. I'm standing on the Cunliffe station carrying a hold-all. He's focused on my hand and holding the bag, and the train is in the background, blurred and out of focus. In many ways, he's free to take greater risks, because there's still part of me when we're taking shots, particularly on the main line, where there is something about me wanting to take a slightly more classic view, because it's perhaps running the locomotive along that line for the first time for 40 or 50 years. I won't take the risk. I will play safe and take perhaps a more classic view, where because of his age, he obviously cannot remember steam first time, and therefore it doesn't have some of the connections that I do, that he can take what perhaps you would say is the much more high-risk shot, the particular narrow view or something like that. And it's only now, once the collection is built up, perhaps on the main line, I'll be far more experimental than I was in the past. But it's interesting, you know, that between us, we know exactly who shot what, but people who view that site in particular wouldn't necessarily know that.
One of your riskiest shots, which pays off amazingly, but it breaks so many rules, it's nuts, is A4 Bittern accelerating through the suburbs of Bath. Now, what we have going on here, it's super high contrast. The photo isn't even technically level. The horizon is at a 45-degree angle. What is horizontal with the frame is the tracks. The steam locomotive's in the lower left. It's got this streak effect going on where it's kind of a pan but kind of isn't. There's the footbridge crossing over at a strange angle. It's so dramatic. It's so very bold and dramatic, but it manages to work.
Yeah. Again, it was a shot that it was unusually, that was very much planned, because Bath is not too far away from Cardiff, and I'd been to Bath. My favourite location in Bath is Sydney Gardens, where you have this park which runs alongside Brunel's beautiful tunnels, and it's like a stage setting for steam trains to run through parkland. And I was looking for other locations around the area, and I happened to be on top of one of those beautiful bar stone walls looking over. And I had a very wide angle lens, a 10mm on the camera, and I took a unit going past, and I thought, yes, that's, the scene and everything else. And a few weeks later, an A4, and it really only works because it's an A4, because it's very, very sleek. So I deliberately went just went above, took that, and just as it passed, I went click, click, click to get it. But it was planned because it was something that I'd seen earlier, and I just thought, yes, that may work. And it's probably one of the more dramatic images I've taken. Again, one that I'm very pleased, and thank you for picking it out.
I feel like I could pick out any one of your photos because any one of them's amazing, and any one of them has such story and character to it. In particular, though, I'm really intrigued by where you find your footing with the charters that you're a part of, either as a photographer or as a model/character. How did you enter that world, and what has that been like for you?
Um, I suppose I mean, initially concentrated when I took this up, in sort of 2006, 7. At that time, charters were very much a closed world. It wasn't something that was advertised to the public. It was simply a group of friends who would come together, know each other, organise it with the railway, and it was very much not, who you knew to get you involved with that world. That's completely changed now. Over the last 5-6 years, the charter market has changed dramatically, and there's lots of different, effectively professional businesses that now run those operations. But that's where the start point. And it was only because I'd started to have pictures published and I began to hear about these things that I got introduced, and you go along and you take part and everything else. I suppose the why charters, it's very, very different as preserved, railways are to the main line. The main line is, if you like, big game hunting, and I certainly don't agree with big game hunting, absolutely. But in terms of the feel of the chase, you're putting all your skills, your planning and everything else against so many variables. You have, there's a steam run of perhaps 200 miles of main line. Where do you go? How do you get there? Where's the best place? What are the views like? Half the main line is now overgrown. The other half has got palisade fencing in. In the UK, trespassing is absolutely not even considered. So you have to pick your locations very carefully. Then you're dependent on things like gradients, on weather, on lighting. There are so many things that you have to take into account. So you use all those and just hope that it works. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. In the world of charter and preserved railways, you're talking about a very much more controlled environment. You can run the train when the sun comes out. You can get very, very close to the track. You have some control over what the consist is in terms of the passenger carriages and the wagons in a goods train. So it's a very much more controlled environment. There is no doubt that, as I said earlier, I want to capture as much variety as possible, and you can only do that in the world of charter. I mean, obviously there are no freight trains on the main line anymore. So just simply to capture a freight train. Now, it's not a real freight train because it's not real goods and it's not going between two places carrying that goods. Whereas in the main line, although it's a charter, it really is going between one place and another and is carrying people and fare paying passengers and everything else. So you are controlling it, but it allows you to get shots which you can't get in any other way, or which the public can't get, because you can get very close. You can go with when there's properly permission and everything else, and there's a responsible officer and it's all protected and everything else. You can go inside a tunnel. You can take photographs from one of the other running lines and all those things. Safety is obviously very critical, but it can be controlled in ways that it can't be controlled in a live environment. In terms of the reenacting, I wanted to sort of have the idea that at least if the groups would go on these things, if half of them would only wear coats and hats and everything else, it would provide opportunities for half the group to be passengers, or fill a scene on a railway platform and everything else. But so far that's proving hard work. But that was the reason for doing it. It's good fun. And like when you do anything, you then understand far more about the fashions and why they wear what they did. And again, it makes it become more live and more real to you.
Where you're working with human subjects as well, and you do care about incorporating the person into the scene, when you're working with models and you can stage them in particular ways, putting yourself on the other side of the lens and practicing that angle of it and figuring out what do I need as direction when somebody else wants to take a photo of me, I imagine that's beneficial as well.
Oh, you have a totally different perspective. And you realize as a reenactor that unless you're directed, you're just hopeless. And I mean, I try very, very hard not to take the posed shot, because the posed shot is a posed shot. It can't ever be anything different. I will always take my photographs where we've posed people. I will take them after they've been relaxed, and then they're just simply naturally talking, naturally doing things. And it's always important when people are doing something for real. So whether it's an engine fitter who is repairing a locomotive, whether it's a driver driving or a fireman firing or whatever, or a guard blowing his whistle, it has to be for real, because only then do you get those expressions that are real. You can't do it just by standing there posing. If you stand and the photographer suggests, we'll just sort of stand there and chat to somebody, it doesn't work.
If you weren't a fascinating enough individual, Robin, in addition to all of this, you are now a research student of heritage railways at the University of Birmingham. What is all of that about?
I've always wanted to do a PhD, and I didn't have the opportunity first time round, so I have a little bit more time on my hands at the moment. So I've taken partial retirement, although I'm probably far busier now than I've ever been. But it came from really two things. I always said that when I could, I would want to put something back into railways, and particularly the heritage railway movement, because I've had so much pleasure from it, which I just can't thank all the dedicated people who have made that possible. It's an amazing group of people who don't always agree with each other, and they do tend to have squabbles. And one of the things I did get involved with, there was a slight squabble on one of the heritage railways, which is called the West Somerset Railway, involving their support group. And I chaired an independent review, a 6-month independent review into it. And it gave me, coming from very much a consultant's professional world, because a lot of the work I used to do was overseas on major projects and assessment of organizations, and sort of beginning to apply those skills and everything else to what effectively is volunteers, which are charities, organizations that don't work to the same rules and pressures that commercial organizations work to, was an unbelievable eye-opener. And what you realize when you go around a lot of these railways, the age profile of perhaps some of the volunteers and everything else, you realize how fragile, and if we are to keep heritage steam going for our children's children, then we need to make sure that things like the governance and everything else really is in place, that is recognizing that the world is changing, and heritage railways have to change with it. So rather than just guessing it, I thought it would be nice to do some proper research, because you realize that when you start to look, there is very little research into heritage railways, how they work, and particularly their governance. Hopefully after 3 years, I might be able to provide a few more answers.
It's interesting that you're describing it as needing more governance, because from an outsider's perspective, especially those of us in the U.S. where opportunities for STEAM, yes, we're a larger country, but it's still few and farther between. We look at everything going on your side of the pond and think, this is all amazing and super coordinating and fantastic, all of which is true. So it's interesting to hear you say, yes, but it can be better.
What has been achieved probably can't have been better. It's 1,000 times better than it ever could be. How we keep it at that level and what level we keep it at is the much more interesting question, because it's inevitable that a lot of the people that are contributing to it, the financial model of heritage railways only works if you have a large volunteer base. There are one or two purely commercial railways with all paid staff, but the majority of them, whether it's the Severn Valley, the West Somerset, the North Yorkshire, the East Lancs, or whatever, any of those, Great Central, they all work on the basis that the volunteers are not only providing a very substantial element of the labour, which is why British Rail closed them in the first place, is because they were not commercially viable. Plus, the ticket revenue is only paying for the coal, the water, the consumables. So the locomotives are there, the infrastructure is there only by fundraising, donations, grants, support, legacies. How you make that sustainable not just over the next 5 years, which is not a problem. It will just carry on, because what heritage railways have proved is that they are incredibly resilient. Touch wood, very, very few of them have failed. You're talking about a sector that has been going now 30, 40 years. It's very mature and has been remarkable, because think of any other sector and there would have been far many casualties and everything else. So the sector's proved remarkable. And the question really is, will it just stay that way because it always has done and always will be, or because the world of which we're living in now, we're living in a world of social media where there are many different opportunities, different pressures, different fashions, different regulations. How are heritage railways going to respond to that? I mean, there's always the battle between authenticity and attracting families. The enthusiast market is inevitably changing. The peak of railway enthusiasts were in the 60s. It's my generation. We're all getting older. The subsequent generations have had different opportunities. They haven't experienced steam for real. There is no doubt, because there are many young volunteers who, once they get involved, like all of us, they have a lifelong interest. Can we ensure that we get enough of those to make it work? I mean, at the moment, the UK works on about 18,000 volunteers. That has to be constantly refreshed every generation, not just now, not just in the next 25 years, but in the next 50 years, 75 years, 100 years, if we are to keep this going.
How does the University of Birmingham connect to all of this?
It's got a rail research. It's one of the leading research universities for rail transport in the world. It has a lot of international connections. It's all about systems and processes of the modern railway. It's interesting that they were very interested in looking at the heritage scene. Because in many ways, the heritage scene can explain such a lot. I mean, a lot of the researchers come from all over the world, a lot from Asia, China, Africa, and it's interesting that they have very little idea of railway heritage. So having that as perhaps a component within the university has got to be a good thing.
Oh, absolutely. And the fact that an institution like that takes this industry seriously is vastly important, because it needs to be taken seriously for it to be sustainable.
It is. And I mean, that's what the industry has managed to achieve, because in the early days, it certainly wasn't taken seriously. It was just groups of fanatics who had mad ideas and were doing things that people didn't think that would work. But they were proved the public was proved wrong, because it did. They become tourist attractions in their own right. They became centres of research, of engineering excellence, of keeping traditional skills alive. The UK Heritage Railway is worth about, at best guess, something like £250 million to UK PLC in terms of GDP generated, and many tourist areas, North Wales, west coast of Scotland, rely very much on the local railway attraction to bring in people. It's the major tourist attraction. So suddenly people have woken up. This is actually a very important industry. It's a means of making the UK in its heritage offer, which is world known. It's an important and component part. I mean, part of the vision I'm doing working with Tyneside and vintage trains is that when HS2 comes along, the Japanese, the Chinese, the African tourist can simply jump on HS2, be in Birmingham within 45 minutes, and then be on a steam express dining to Stratford, which is a wonderful experience for them. Now, in order for that to happen, it's not going to happen by luck or accident. It's going to happen because a lot of people are going to have to work very hard to make it work.
Wow. Just wow. All of that sounds amazing. And I can't wait. And I'm sure all of us cannot wait to hear more of your exploration through this and what you come across and what you discover, because that is going to be beneficial to us as well. Different countries, different systems, yes, but there are still takeaway lessons from this that will have no borders.
Yeah. I mean, if nothing else, steam wasn't just a revolution in the UK. It wasn't just a revolution in Europe or America. It changed the world. And people can identify that in all sorts of ways.
So besides continuing your studies here, what are some of the things that you're looking forward to in the coming years? What are projects you have planned? What are things that you're excited about?
Good question. I think it would be very exciting. In the past, because of the technology that was left over, we've used mostly things from the 40s, 50s, 60s, because it all went to Barry Scrapyard. That's what heritage railways basically run on. But that's only one small part of railway history. It would be very nice, and what has been set by things like the Tornado project is the proof that you can actually build steam locomotives from scratch, run them on the main line, and for them to become absolutely famous. With a media profile, and it's happened with Tornado, it's happened with the relaunch of Flying Scotsman. The public have come out in droves. It appears on the media. It's no longer some geeky hobby. People actually want to go and see it and everything else. But as I said, that's only one part of the history of railways. There is the whole Victorian period, which is largely forgotten, which has incredible drama, excitement, political intrigue. Anything that's going on politically now was magnified 100-fold in Victorian times. And wouldn't it be nice to be able to recreate some of those trains, put them back on the main line, experience things in a very different world, perhaps to get finally, the day of the Mark I coach running up and down the Heritage Railway? Why not have reproduced Victorian coaches? Give people a completely new experience.
The key to 21st century rail preservation is experience. Whatever it takes to create that experience, that's going to be what it's about. The 20th century was building the foundation, collecting the equipment. Now it's how do we take that further than it's ever been before? And that's going to be amazing to see.
It is, because it's one of those things that we're living in a very different world to the world that I was a child. And for young people, it's to be involved with a heritage railway. It's teaching you traditional skills where you bash bits of metal. You do things in a very tactile. To get up early in the morning and couple a locomotive when it is freezing cold, and you pick that coupling up, it's heavy and it's very, very cold, and it's early morning, and you have to consider safety and all those things in a way that most people don't do when they're sitting at a laptop or reacting with computers or anything electronic. These are real experiences. We began the talk by saying, standing on a wayside station late at night when it's absolutely quiet, and then hearing the sort of the distant sort of, the whistle blowing, and then suddenly in a flash, that train is through. The lights are gleaming from the carriages. The brass is flashing in the lights. The pistons are going. The steam's going everywhere. That's an experience that you can only have for real. You can't get that from a YouTube video.
Absolutely. Robin, thank you so much for joining us here on the Roundhouse to talk about your photographic work, this study, and your work on your PhD that you're engaging with. My mind is blown right now in a million ways, and I've really enjoyed this thoroughly. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now, the question of the day.
It's not just about the trains. It's about how you showcase them. A couple of episodes back, we were talking to Kathleen McCarthy, who's the head curator of the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, about their rail exhibits and how they display their equipment and conveying that history. which led to the question, what is the most interesting railroad exhibit you've ever seen? This from a Patreon supporter of ours, John O'Clair. It's either the sectional engine at Steamtown or the Baldwin 60,000 setup. This from David D'Amico, Age of Steam Roundhouse, hands down. Agreed, David. I'd love to see it in person and hope to get the opportunity to. Very few photographs out there, so a good topic to cover on the show here for sure. And lastly, from Bernard Kempinski, B&O Museum Roundhouse, loaded with early steam engines and cars. Definitely a theme of roundhouses here, but hey, we're the Roundhouse. We welcome that. Your question of the day for this episode is, what photographer inspires you? Let me know on the roundhousepodcast.com. Check out the show notes for episode 60. We have examples of Robin's photos there. Man, the guy is an absolute master. He is amazing. You have to check out his photos. Thank you for joining us here. And remember, as always, that the Roundhouse is our house.